Mr. President, today we have once again gathered in the Security Council on the initiative of Ukraine and its European sponsors. In recent years, such meetings have become a routine element of the anti-Russian information campaign. They do not carry any positive charge and do not bring the crisis under control. I would like to ask the European sponsors, are you not tired of listening to the same thing over and over again? European delegations, at the request of the Ukrainians, can convene a council at least every day, compete with each other in hypocrisy and anti-Russian rhetoric, express solidarity with Kiev, talk about the need to protect democracy and international law, fabricate unproven situations. By the way, today they were sent to Chernobyl. It would be better if you look at what the General Director of the State Agency of Russia said about this. But there is a problem. All these words are devoid of any connection with reality. Because the Western countries, which speak most about the humanism and suffering of peaceful citizens, demonstrated their true face to the whole world exactly a week ago. When there was an incident with the BPLA in the Romanian Gala, a voiceless accusation against Russia by the leadership of the EU, NATO, as well as the member states of the European Union followed. They were voiced during the SSE meeting, where the words of solidarity with the victims of the European Union were also voiced. Expressing sympathy to the victims is a normal human reaction, and we do not discuss it at all. A similar case took place recently in the seaport of Constancev, where a sea drone exploded, and immediately, without any grounds, Russia was put in charge again. But not because the drone was Russian, but because Russia allegedly initially attacked Ukraine. I would like to emphasize that it was initially clear that we are talking about the Ukrainian sea drone, which the Kiev regime planned to use to carry out terrorist acts against civilian sea vessels, as it did in Greece, by the way. Greece is silent about this at the SSE meetings, to carry out terrorist acts against civilian sea vessels and to create a safety threshold for shipping in the Black Sea. And where is the request for a meeting of the Security Council? Where is the fiery speech of the Romanian Ministry of Internal Affairs? Silence. And where are all these European supporters of international human rights? They were only a few weeks ago when the Zelensky regime bloodily killed 21 students and wounded over 40 people as a result of a terrorist strike on the school building and the dormitory of the college in Starobetsk. The lives of all the very young girls and boys were broken in just one moment. Even after the information of the tragedy spread all over the world, the most pro-declared luminous democracies continued to blockade the Kiev cult. They could not even express an elementary word of sympathy to the families of the victims. This is not even a double standard, but a system of political selection of human suffering. Some victims are declared worthy of sympathy. Others are deliberately drawn out of the information space, when the goal is to discredit the Zelensky regime and demonize Russia. As we expected, the Kiev regime did not stop and committed another bloody crime. On June 3rd, a passenger bus from Moscow to Simferopol was shelled in the city center of Inakievo, Luhansk, Donetsk People's Republic. Its cabin was completely burned down, 7 people were killed, 11, including 1 child, were injured. After the shelling, UAVs of the USSR scouts were recorded in the sky above the scene of the tragedy, which recorded the consequences of the committed military crime. The death of people in Starobelsk and Inakievo is only a small part of the crimes of the militants of the Kiev regime, who daily strike at civilian facilities near the border, strike on residential buildings, educational and medical institutions, and hunt for civilians. The USSR has just struck a passenger train from Moscow to Simferopol. A driver's assistant was killed. Was it a military facility? During the period from May 25th to May 31st, 217 civilians of Russia were injured by the shelling of the USSR. 35 people, including 3 children, were killed. 182 people were injured, including minors. 374 ammunition was fired at civilian facilities. Naturally, Western countries and the UN Secretariat preferred not to notice these deaths. We call on the UN Secretary-General to decisively condemn the crimes committed by the militants of the Zelensky regime against the peaceful citizens of Starobelsk and Kiev. Silence, verbal equilibrium, and the withdrawal from the direct assessment of the crimes of the USSR are equivalent to encouraging the policy of terror against civilians. Mr. Chairman, in response to the terrorist attack on Starobelsk, as well as a number of other strikes by the USSR on the peaceful population of civilian facilities, the Russian armed forces strike high-precision weapons on enterprises of the defense industrial complex, facilities of the Ukrainian fuel and transport infrastructure used in the interests of the USSR, as well as military airfields. As a result, in recent times, 10 enterprises producing military equipment, including strike APCs, including the Abris PT Union, enterprises of the radio electronic industry, the Special Design Bureau of the Spectrum, the Mayak plant shareholder, Society, and the state-owned company Ukrospec Export. Also in Kiev, 3 territorial centers of the USSR were hit. In Zaporozhye, a strike was made on the workshops of the Amelchenko machine-building plant and an aircraft engine of the Motor Sich construction plant. In the Dnepropetrovsk region, on the enterprise of the Firepoint Company, which produced the components for the strike APCs of long-range missile weapons, as well as on the logistics center. In the Kharkov region, on 3 enterprises of the USSR, including the Kharkov State Aviation Enterprise, and 2 facilities of the Ukrainian fuel and energy complex used by the USSR. In the Sumy region, on the Shostkino state-owned plant Zvezda. Strikes were also made on the enterprises of the military industry in the Khmelnytsky and Poltava regions, and on the infrastructure of 6 military airfields in the Cherkasy, Rovino, Zhytomyr, Kirovograd, Khmelnytsky, and Kiev regions. Unlike the Kiev regime, which not only shelled the peaceful objects of Russia, but also deliberately used the civil infrastructure and its population as a living shield, the armed forces of Russia hit only military targets and facilities used in the interests of the USSR. The victims that arise among the peaceful population of Ukraine are the result of the disorderly and chaotic work of the Ukrainian Air Force, which, in violation of the norms of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, is placed in residential quarters. Mr. Chairman, for 12 years after the authorities in Ukraine, as a result of a bloody coup d'etat directly supported by Western countries, have seized Ukrainian politicians, the situation in this country is getting worse and worse. In fact, the destruction of the Ukrainian people is underway. Millions have left the country. Hundreds of thousands have been killed, driven like cattle to war with Russia. It is becoming more and more difficult to forcefully mobilize people. Therefore, in Europe, the status of temporary protection for Ukrainians of the call-up age has been discussed. With Zelensky's efforts, the multi-million country has become a consumable material in the senseless crusade of the Western Russophobic elites against Russia. There have always been many politicians in Ukraine who, while lobbying between the West and Russia, tried to sit on 2 chairs at the same time. However, the bet was made on Zelensky, apparently because he was ready to change the future of this country at the expense of the West in the form of material benefits for himself and his relatives. The corruption scandals of the last few months have revealed all these facts. Have you ever wondered why there was no clear reaction from the Western countries to this? The answer is simple. The Western countries are ready to pay this price personally, to embezzle Zelensky and his henchmen, just so that he does not stop the war. At the same time, it should be understood that the so-called collective West, which finances the Ukrainian regime, bears no less, and perhaps even more, responsibility for everything that is happening. The representative of Great Britain, who carefully portrays himself as the main benefactor of the Ukrainian people, is distinguished by a special cynicism and hypocrisy. I would like to emphasize that they do not care about the scale of the reprisals that the Kiev neo-Nazis would have committed immediately after our departure against the local population, first of all against the hateful Russians and the so-called collaborators. At the meeting of the Security Council on the fall of the BPL in Romania on July 1st, The representative of Great Britain stated, I quote, "Russia bears full responsibility for this escalation and the growing threat to regional and Euro-Atlantic security. This incident is a direct consequence of the illegal and full-scale invasion of Russia into Ukraine, as a result of which more than 15,000 civilians have been killed since February 2022. In this regard, it is especially important to remind you once again of the episode that more than eloquently testifies to the shameful role that London has played and continues to play in delaying the conflict in Ukraine. In April 2022, the infamous Boris Johnson, then Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, rushed to Kiev to prevent Russia and Ukraine from signing the peace agreements already signed in Istanbul. In this regard, I would like to ask the representative of Great Britain, who should bear responsibility for the deaths of 15,000 civilians and the blood of tens of thousands of wounded and crippled Ukrainians on their hands. In a hypocritical way, I appeal to the world. You and your accomplices from other European countries have done and continue to do everything to ensure that the bloodshed continues indefinitely. I repeat, if the Istanbul agreements had been signed, the hostilities would have ended about a month after the outbreak of the conflict. There would have been no so many dead and wounded. There would have been no destruction of the territory of Ukraine and Russia. There would have been no drones in the sky over Romania, Latvia, and other European countries that our former Western partners are cunningly issuing for the Russian ones. For us, it is obvious that if the current European elites do not give up, and do not give up on the crazy idea of defeating Russia strategically, all new human sacrifices and destruction will inevitably occur. Believe me, there is simply no plan B in European countries that have suffered from the colonial times to the utmost degree of chaos and exclusivity. Mr. Chairman, we cannot but comment on the so-called open letter from Zelensky to the President of Russia, Putin, which is not a peaceful initiative, but an insolent provocation aimed at camouflaging Kiev's desperate attempts to disrupt any negotiations in search of ways to resolve the conflict. Under the guise of calling for dialogue and hoping to get the media effect it needs, Zelensky only repeats the old threats and propaganda clichés. Such insolent maneuvers, and in addition openly sewn with white threads, not only do not bring peace, but only confirm the incompatibility of his capabilities in Kiev, outside the Nazi gang. This message has already been commented on by the President of Russia and his predecessor, the Minister of Foreign Affairs. Before writing such so-called open letters, you should first cancel your own decree, which forbade you to negotiate with the President of Russia yourself. Well, if you still want to talk, find a way to convey your desire discreetly and not with the help of megaphone diplomacy. However, as has already been said, there is nothing to talk about with the regime of Zelensky, which has openly embarked on the path of terrorism. The imitations of negotiations and performances played out in public are alien to us. We strive for a stable and long-term settlement of the conflict. Until Kamsky and Timotov talk to us in our language, we do not have to talk about real negotiations, and especially about meetings at the highest level. Until Zelensky fully realizes the error of his course, we will achieve our goals not by diplomatic policy, but by military means. Thank you.